Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am joined again with Keith Preston to conclude with part two of our history of the First World War. Now, Keith, one of the important things about the actual practice of the First World War was the English blockade. The English blockade was in many ways one of the thorny issues that directly brought American involvement into the war itself. The blockade itself is the suspect, because a blockade, by definition, is indiscriminatory. It will starve women and children as much as it'll starve soldiers on the front. And the British blockade not only affected Germany, but other parts of Europe as well, including most of Belgium, which was occupied by the Germans. And the searching and seizure of ships bound to Germany to check for cargo and contraband was a violation of the rights of neutrals. American ships should not have been subjected to those actions. Whereas when the English high seas fleet had impressed U.S. sailors in 1812, we went to war. 100 years later, when they're doing it, we're like, it's okay. They're the British. They can do it. But when the Germans protested, it fell on deaf ears. In fact, the injustice of it and the hypocrisy of the Wilson administration caused now I forget his name. Who was that populist who gave the Cross of Gold speech?
William Jennings Bryan.
Yes, he resigned from the Wilson government over the treatment of that affair. Another thing was, according to the rules of war, a merchant raider, a submarine, or a surface vessel was supposed to give fair warning to a merchant ship and then search the vessel. And if it was found to have contraband, allow the crew to leave the vessel and give them safe passage away, and then sink it. Now, that was all well and good until the British started implementing Q ships. And Q ships were basically merchant vessels which were armed with deck guns that were hidden in secret. And so if any U-boat would surface to implement the required procedures, they would be blown out of the water. You can imagine after a while, U-boat captains realized that they would shoot first and ask questions later. And so the United States protested German sinking of commerce ships, but not the English violation or misuse of the privileges of merchant shipping by arming them as Q ships.
Yeah, well, it's interesting how World War One, as I said in a previous episode, it really does mark a kind of turning point where not only do you see war being transferred from being this kind of idea of the King's War to being a war of ideology, and not only do you start to see where it starts becoming a war between soldiers to a war between societies, but you also start to see war crimes essentially becoming legitimized. You start to see things that in past wars would have been considered war crimes, such as targeting civilians, such as initiating blockades, such as using civilians as a shield. All of those things were considered essentially unlawful forms of combat in earlier wars. Now, in the Civil War in the United States, the Union had practiced some of those kinds of things as well. As I said before, that's a kind of a dress rehearsal for the total wars of the 20th century. But in World War One, we really start seeing this kind of stuff coming into fruition. We start to see, for example, like you were saying, the use of civilian ships as a cover for warships, arming civilian ships, and then, presumably because civilians are supposed to get a free pass. So essentially they're trying to cheat at the rules of war. But more and more, we just see the rules of war being discarded entirely. And of course, by World War II, entire civilian populations become fair game. In fact, the kinds of war that went on during World War II really, the goal was to try to kill as many civilians as possible with the bombings in Dresden and Hamburg and in Tokyo and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and of course with the scorched earth policies in Eastern Europe and so forth as well. But World War One really gets the ball rolling with that. And as I said before, the number of civilian casualties in World War One was about as high as the number of soldiers who were killed. And then that escalates in World War II as well. So you do see this kind of breakdown of civilization, if you will, in World War I in a way that had been somewhat unprecedented over a period of the past few hundred years before that.
Yes, exactly. One important, it's important in the sense of the mistaken opinion drawn from it. During the German occupation of Belgium, the British propaganda ministry created various salacious tales of raping nuns and decapitating soldiers and maiming children, all of which were completely preposterous. Now, there had been a Belgian sort of guerrilla resistance in the opening weeks of the invasion. And the Germans replied, essentially by, for every one of us you kill, we'll kill X number of you. And of course, that was seen as the worst thing ever. Of course, that's exactly what the British did in the American Revolution against American snipers. And that's exactly what the Yankees did in the Civil War against what they called bushwhackers. So really, it's kind of hypocritical because the British and Americans would avail themselves of such measures against guerrilla fighters, and in fact, on a far larger scale. Backing up a little bit, during the Franco-Prussian War, General Philip Sheridan was a U.S. observer to the German invasion. And he chided the Germans as being too lenient, too gentle on the French. He said that they should have left the French with nothing but their eyes to weep over the desolation. And if we look at the harshness and pathology of American war making a mountain out of a molehill of the German pacification of Belgium is really kind of too much.
Yeah, well, talking about war propaganda, another interesting thing about World War I was that it really was one of the first wars where the whole modern concept of propaganda was put into action. World War I occurred during the same time that the modern, what is now called the mass media, was really in its embryonic stage. It occurred during the same time that the revolution in advertising was starting to take place, where the advertising industry, as we now understanding, was starting to develop, when the public relations industry, as we now understand it, was starting to develop as literacy rates were rising, and so there was a wider circulation of newspapers and magazines and things of that nature. I'm not sure how available radio was at that time, but that was an embryonic technology at the time as well. Silent films and all of that kind of stuff as well. So this is really the first war where you have the war effort being supported by professional public relations and professional propaganda systems. One of the influential figures that emerged during this same time period was a guy named Edward Bernays, who was really sort of a pioneer in the whole field of propaganda and using public relations as a means of influencing popular opinion in the direction that you want it to go in. If you're somebody, whether in the government or an industry or wherever, and you want to influence public opinion in your direction, the whole idea of PR was really Bernays and to a large degree that pioneered that. This was also during the time that you mentioned Sigmund Freud in the previous episode. This was during the time that psychology was also an embryonic science, and Freud, of course, was the pioneer in that. But one thing that a lot of these earlier psychologists were interested in was crowd psychology and mob psychology. You had thinkers like Wilfred Trotter and Gustav Le Bon, and they started developing this idea of whole theoretical systems about, well, what really motivates crowds, what really gets people worked up. How can you generate mass hysteria? In the First World War, you had for the first time public authorities using some of these techniques, using this embryonic mass media, using this embryonic public relations industry, using this embryonic science of psychology to really figure out how to manipulate public opinion, to the point of irrationality, to the point of creating a type of mob psychology where it's just all about going and attacking them because they're them and we're us. You really start to see this kind of thing emerge during the First World War, this kind of mob psychology, this kind of fanatical nationalism. It's just sort of people losing themselves in the crowd, if you will. In earlier wars, there wasn't as much of that. In earlier wars, you would see people looking at the war. Well, okay, the king and his soldiers are fighting their king and his soldiers, and a lot of times, common people didn't really even view themselves as having a stake in the war. They looked at it like it was something that the rulers were doing for themselves, and the average peasant or whatever just didn't want to get drafted or whatever the situation might have been. But it's during this time where you have you have this growing mass media, this growing public relations industry, this effort to manipulate public opinion with psychological insights. And you also have the growth of nationalism and mass society during this time as well. That's another thing that's interesting about this same time period, is that this is when the Industrial Revolution is really starting to crystallize, and it's really starting to produce this kind of mass commercial consumer society of which we're familiar with today. This is the same time that all of that is beginning as well. All of these forces are converging at the same time, and I think a lot of that is what made World War I as intense and as massive as it was. You had the growth of mass societies, you had the growth of mass democracy, you had industrial technology, the media, new ways of generating more effective forms of propaganda, depicting the enemy as some sort of subhuman, scourge on humanity or whatever.
Yeah. It's also the Germans were manifoldly incompetent at the art of propaganda, at least during the First World War. Hitler would later write in Mein Kampf that the success of propaganda in the First World War, he was determined not to make that mistake in the Second, make sure that Germany had a decent propaganda system. And that system of mass culture, mass media, mass psychology that was created during the war years was taken over by Madison Avenue in the 1920s with Bernays. So in many ways, there's been an ongoing psychological warfare against the American people by both the federal government and the corporations based off of the war footing of the First World War. And it's never really ceased, which when you think about it is pretty unbelievable that we've had, about 100 years of psychological warfare against ourselves by our own government and our corporations. One of the interesting things is World War I is this transition between a gentleman's war and a total war. We're all familiar with the Christmas truce of December of 1914, where the Germans came out of the trench and celebrated Christmas with the English and played a game of football, soccer, not American football, in between the trenches. Now, of course, the generals couldn't let that stand, and so they divided the troops up and made sure that would never happen again. But it's also interesting that in 1916, on the Eastern Front between the Austrians and the Russians, there was an Easter truce. And it's almost like these soldiers are like, what are we fighting each other for? I have nothing against you. And, the higher-ups were like, we just can't stand. They had to break them up and shift them around the front so they couldn't get all friendly again. They couldn't fraternize. I think it was in... can't think of the name of the novel now, that famous German World War I novel. But in that, they have a section where the soldiers say, we should just have the president of France and the Kaiser fight it out in a boxing match, and that'll solve the war. But and then, of course, we have with the fighter pilots. In fact, while in the trenches, the sort of chivalry and mystique was disappearing rather rapidly, in the air, it lingered on longer. Both in England and France and in Germany, they saw themselves as the knights of the air. And there was almost kind of a medieval chivalry about it. Like fighter planes would wave at each other as they flew by, because initially airplanes were observation; they were recon airplanes. but naturally became fighter interceptors to shoot down the enemy recon so they couldn't get observation on your positions. But eventually that did catch up with the air forces as well, where the sort of chivalry, the sort of old style was gradually phased out. But the Air Corps was one of the last holdouts. And I guess you could say the first side to apply scientific methods to aerial combat were the Germans, with Belke and the Red Baron, von Richthofen, where they created their flying circuses, which allowed them to have 2 Fokker scourges. Fokker was the name of the airplane designer that produced much of Germany's fighters. In 1915 and 1917 were the 2 Fokker scourges. Now, the Allies never really reached a level of sophistication in aerial organization that the Germans did, but through mass production, they just literally overwhelmed them with sheer numbers. There were so many French, American, and British airplanes that it didn't matter how good the flying circus was, it was going to get shot down anyhow.
Yeah, well, I think the technological innovations that happened during this time period, particularly things like fighting war from the air, in some ways influenced the psychology of warfare, in the sense that when you're fighting someone on the battlefield and you're actually seeing the people that you're shooting at or who are shooting at you, there's a certain personal dimension to that doesn't exist when you're simply dropping bombs from the air, or you're having bombs dropped on you from the air, or you don't really know who you're fighting. You just know that there are blasts coming from some other direction. I think that in that kind of circumstance, it's also has the effect of changing the psychology of war, where you're no longer fighting other people. You're fighting entities, or you're just fighting masses. Not only do you have the growth of mass society, and mass culture, but you have mass armies as well. You have much larger armies, and the methodology that's being used because of the technological advancements tends to make war, on one hand, more destructive, but on the other hand, more impersonal. In contemporary war, it's often said, well, contemporary war, at least for Americans, is like playing video games or something like that. And of course, that's not true. I mean, someone's actually been in combat in Iraq or Afghanistan or something like that. It's not good. It knows what combat is, but it does. Technology does have this effect of depersonalizing war. And in that sense, I do think it becomes a lot easier to regard the enemy as no longer human. The enemy simply becomes the other. It's interesting to look at some of the political literature that emerged after World War One. In one work, of course, that I'm interested in is the works of Carl Schmitt, who lived in Germany in the Weimar Republic after World War One. Immediately, he did his most famous writing during that time period, and he wrote a book called The Concept of the Political. And in that, he argues that the essence of politics is when you have armed collectives that are ready to fight to the death. He said the essence of politics is the distinction of friend and enemy, or friend and foe. The idea that there's an existential threat posed by this particular foe, and obviously his thinking was shaped by the experiences of Germany and the other European nations and Asian nations as well in World War One, in that this really was the first modern war where there was an existential element to this particular war. It wasn't just fighting over territory. It really was a system where whole societies were mobilized to fight one another. Compared to World War One, a lot of the earlier wars that had happened over the previous centuries weren't that much different than rivalries between street gangs in a neighborhood or something like that. It was more that kind of thing on a larger scale. It was more just about territory and interest and that kind of stuff. But World War One really does make war more ideological, more massive, more impersonal, and more existential in nature.
Yes. In many ways, this idea of a mass culture and a mass war begins with the French Revolution and really goes mainstream in World War One. And we can see that impersonalization even more so today with remote-controlled flying vehicles that can fire missiles and kill people when you could fly a ROV from Iowa, United States, and blow up somebody in Afghanistan. It's really a discontinuation of that same process. And as far as the psychological impact of war, one of my personal favorite authors was deeply affected by the First World War, and that's J.R.R. Tolkien, who's famous for his Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And one of the things that you see in The Lord of the Rings, especially with Saruman, and to some extent as well with Mordor, is this industrialization and mechanization and impersonalization of war. The bad guys, the orcs, are these nameless, faceless other that you're fighting, and the good guys have a more medieval, chivalric, heroic concept of, you gotta have a fair fight. We're fighting for honor and justice. And of course, Saruman is all mechanical and wheels and machinery. And we see that the sort of unequal struggle between a man in the air and a man on the ground, or a guy with a machine gun and a guy, charging the machine gun. You see with Tolkien's literature, he tries to have it where everybody has a fighting chance. You got to get face to face with your swords or your bows and arrows. And you just can't sit back and blow everybody away at a distance. It's like he's trying to react against that experience and explain it in work against it in his literature. You got.
Well, there's another work that came out of World War One that's one of my favorite works. It's called Storms of Steel by Ernst Junger. It was a German stormtrooper.
Oh, yes, very good.
Yeah, he was a German stormtrooper during World War One, and when he was a combat soldier, he was wounded 17 times. But he was a stormtrooper for about 4 years, and he kept a diary with him at the front lines. And this diary was published in the form of a book called Storms of Steel in the 1920s, and it was a bestseller in Germany. And it's a classic work of war literature, wartime literature. And it's called Storms of Steel because because of the role that steel played in this particular war. This war, World War One, was really the first industrialized war. It was the first time that fully industrialized societies really started to fight wars with each other and use industrial technology, of which steel is a major component. But one thing that's interesting about Junger's take on this is that Junger was the kind of person that actually enjoyed combat. There's a certain personality type, a certain psychological makeup that enjoys being in that kind of experience. I mean, we have some insight into what causes that from modern psychology. We know that from modern psychology that some people have a kind of genetic capacity for fearlessness. They just don't get afraid of things in the way that quote unquote normal people would. I mean, most people, if they're faced with an actual combat situation where it's kill or be killed and people are shooting at them, most people are going to be terrified out of their minds. But there's a type of personality that is to some degree genetically immune to experiencing fear on that level, that where it takes only the most extreme things and even very extreme things that don't make them afraid. But these kinds of people often end up being the best kinds of people to have in combat. When it was often said about Ulysses S. Grant that what made him such a good general, and among other things, was the fact that he was able to remain calm during combat, and probably he had the same kind of psychological makeup. He was somebody that just didn't experience fear that easily. So this kind of psychology is what Junger had as well. But Junger's work is interesting because he really, I think, understood that this war was really the breakdown of civilization. I mean, he's really basically saying, well, we're doing things that in any other context are considered horrible crimes. That's really what we're doing. We're throwing civilization overboard, and we're just becoming full-on criminals, by common standards. And he does. What's interesting though is he doesn't make any moralistic judgments about this of any kind. He's just explaining, well, this is what happened. And one thing though that came out of World War One as well was this idea that the older bourgeois model of society had largely become obsolete. I mentioned Bertrand Russell's quote that no one born before 1914 knows how to be happy, or what it means to be happy. And it was true, as we were discussing, that during the late 19th, early 20th century, European society was fairly pacific and that respect. And then they had this terrible trauma happen of World War One, and a lot of that really served to shape the politics that came after World War One, in the sense that they did think that this kind of bourgeois society based on liberal ideals of republicanism and free trade and that kind of thing had become obsolete. And now you had the growth of nationalism and millenarian, apocalyptic, revolutionary movements. During one of the side effects of World War One that had very far-reaching consequences was the Russian Revolution. I mean, it was really World War One that made the Russian Revolution and the eventual seizure of power by the Bolsheviks possible. There may not have ever been a Bolshevik Revolution if it had not been for that particular war. So that's another interesting aspect of the what came out of this war. But you start to, after the Bolshevik Revolution, you start to see communism growing into a mass movement. You also see ideologies like fascism grow out of World War One. In fact, Mussolini had been a leftist, a leader of the Socialist Party in Italy, and he actually had switched to a pro-war position during World War One. And after that, he went on to found the fascist movement. Of course, we all know that Hitler was a corporal in the Kaiser Wilhelm's army in World War One, and so all of the things that come afterward, the growth of these political movements with this kind of apocalyptic or extremist or millenarian outlook, and which proclaim the liberal order to be dead. All of that really is a major consequence of this particular war.
Yes. I think you hit on a very important result of the war was the Bolshevik Revolution. Well, I think one could argue that the Bolshevik Revolution was probably the most cataclysmic event of the past millennium, given the amount of death and destruction and horror that it caused for the rest of the world. I find it I mentioned this in our previous podcast on the Second World War, and I'll mention it again. I find it extremely interesting that while there are oceans of ink spilled on how we might have stopped Hitler in 1933 or 1936, nobody, to my knowledge, has ever asked the question, how could we have stopped Lenin in 1917 or at any point during the Civil War? Because the Allies did intervene briefly in the Civil War in order to hope to bring Russia back into World War I. But once World War I ended, the goal of keeping the Russians in the war was kind of a non-issue anymore, and they eventually, due to war exhaustion, and began to pull out. The United States, of course, had no real interest in Central Asia or Eastern Europe, so the popular will was against any permanent U.S. presence there. The one allied nation that did have a permanent interest in the region was Japan. Japan wanted to annex the maritime provinces of Kamchatka and Vladivostok, and also Siberia. Under pressure from Britain and the United States, Japan withdrew, which I think in hindsight was colossally stupid, because would you rather have Lenin's Bolshevik tyranny or even at the time, a relatively moderate constitutionally monarchy of Japan? It's kind of a non-issue. And if the Japanese and the Russians fight it out 20 years down the road, what's that to the British or Americans?
Yeah, it is interesting, as you mentioned, that there's this whole industry of historians and political scientists and others, and has been for decades, that talk about what went wrong with Hitler. How could the West have stopped Hitler in time, and and only if Chamberlain or whomever had more foresight or whatever. But we don't see that kind of revision, that kind of emphasis on what could have been done to have stopped Lenin. Even though the regime that Lenin founded and eventually was succeeded by Joseph Stalin, it was every bit as murderous and genocidal and warlike as Hitler's regime was. And I think a lot of that just comes down to the fact that history is written by the victors. Because the Soviet Union was a part of the Allied forces or the against Nazi Germany in World War II, and because in the West, you all throughout the Cold War period and even today, you have intellectuals that essentially sympathize with the Soviet cause or with Marxism or Leninism or some variation of that. I think that gets swept under the rug. What actually happened in Russia. Even though what happened in Russia was a terrible thing. I mean, you had this seizure of power by this fanatical millenarian revolutionary party that were ironically they were actually a major influence on Nazi Germany. And this is something else that a lot of people miss, is that Nazism and fascism proper are somewhat different from each other in that while fascism is certainly extreme, it's certainly authoritarian. It's our modern term totalitarianism is derived from it. It was certainly very warlike. Nazism is something that's even more extreme. And while Nazism was influenced by fascism in terms of the uniforms and open palm salutes and some of the other accoutrements of fascism, it's also true that the idea of the dictatorship of the party, of the cult of the party, was derived from communism. I mean, by the time that the Nazis took power in Germany in 1933, the Soviet Union had already been in place for about 15 years at that point, and Stalin had already been in power for a number of years at that point. And I think that my reading of history, at least, is that the Nazi movement was at least as influenced by that as they were by fascism, by fascism proper. Nazism is kind of an extreme form of fascism that's influenced heavily by the communist model of totalitarianism as well. Now, obviously, they take out the Marxist ideology and they put in things like the Aryanism and ideas that came out of 19th century Germanic thought that was kind of on the fringe, or European thought, like Houston Stewart Chamberlain and some of that kind of stuff.
Yes. In many ways, Nazism and fascism were purely reactive to the dangers of international Bolshevism. In fact, during the 1920s, even Ludwig von Mises came to that conclusion. He said in his book Liberalism that Italian fascism was a last-ditch reaction to prevent. He actually praised Italian fascism for stopping the spread of Bolshevism in Europe and other right-wing extreme groups in Europe that prevented the rise of Bolshevism, as kind of the last-ditch effort to stop this. But with the actual Bolshevik Revolution itself, there's, I think, a couple of important things to consider. Of course, without Lenin being shipped back through Germany as a last-ditch effort to leave the war, to have Russia leave the war, it's unlikely that the revolution would have happened. But what people forget is that Trotsky was in exile in the United States at the same time. And the United States secretly allowed Trotsky to escape. In fact, on his trip to Russia, some Canadian patrol boats picked up Trotsky and they said, "Hey, this guy's a terrorist. Should we let him go?" And the government said, "No, just let him go." And of course, Trotsky was invaluable in building the Red Army to successfully prosecute the Russian Civil War. So even without Trotsky, it's doubtful if the Red Army could have repelled the white invaders, because the white counter-revolutionaries, because of his genius at military organization. So it's really, you needed Trotsky and Lenin. And the other most, I think, salient, though today unpopular aspect of the Russian Revolution was its essentially Jewish nature. British and American military intelligence were unanimous in that it was a Jewish movement. Winston Churchill even admitted that it was a Jewish movement. Every eyewitness to the events on the ground always said that it's incredible how influential the Jews are in the Soviet government. And of course, that is one of the main reasons why the Nazis would have a connection with Judeo-Bolshevism.
Well, in the Russian Revolution and then the subsequent Soviet government, it's true that ethnic minorities in the Russian Empire actually played a major role in that. You'd be surprised at how many Bolsheviks and others that were involved in that were not actually ethnic Russians. Lenin himself, I believe, was, I think it was a Tartar. I'm not sure of all the background on that. But
Stalin was a Georgian, Dzerzhinsky was Polish, Bukharin and Kamenev and Zinoviev were Jews.
Yeah, so it was in many ways the Russian Revolution was drawn from the minority ethnic populations in the Russian Empire, and it's clear that it was the revolution was led and in part inspired by people that had very deep-seated animosities towards the Russians themselves, towards the Russian culture and ethnic Russians and things of that nature. And there was a tremendous effort afterwards to uproot all of that. The one thing about communism in Russia is that it wasn't just about, it wasn't like a conventional dictatorship where it's about merely maintaining power and eliminating enemies of the state and things like that, although it was certainly about that as well. But it was also about trying to radically transform the society, in part in the name of the communist ideology, the classless society and all of that kind of stuff. And they came up with this idea of the new Soviet man and all of that. But also, they really wanted to uproot a lot of aspects of traditional Russian culture, in particular the Russian Orthodox Church. They had a special vengeance towards the Russian Orthodox Church. I think Lenin, during his tenure, didn't he do things like turn churches into grain warehouses and things like that? And
oh yeah, exactly. The head of the Cheka was actually a former church.
The head of the Cheka was
the building. I mean, the building, the main location where they interrogated people, where they managed the Cheka bureaucracy, had once been a church. That's what I meant to say.
Yeah, and I know under the Stalinist era, during that time period, the level of repression against the Russian Orthodox Church escalated, and the same thing happened during the Stalinist seizure of Eastern Europe in World War II. At the conclusion of World War II, there was a great deal of repression against the churches in Hungary and Bulgaria and some of those places. So yeah, and looking at it in that context, it does seem that this was very much a cultural and in many ways an ethnic war by the Bolsheviks and their descendants against Russian culture, against ethnic Russians, against traditional Russian culture, against the Russian Orthodox religion, all of these kinds of things. And there were certainly a lot of Jewish ethnics involved in this, and there were plenty of, as I said earlier, there were plenty of other ethnics from throughout the Russian Empire that were involved in this as well. So it's interesting to interpret that in that light. That is an aspect of that I think a lot of Westerners do miss, in the sense that they think of the Soviet Union as simply having been a Russian state or Russian movement, and that's not entirely true. It's certainly there were ethnic Russians obviously involved in creating the Bolshevik movement and later the communist regime of the Soviet Union, but it was more than that. You do see a lot of other influences of that type that had a very deep-seated grudge, if you will, against Russian culture itself.
Yes. Two other very influential results of the First World War, some of which we even see reverberating down to the present day, is the formation of Yugoslavia and the division of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the formation of Yugoslavia was completely an artificial state. Yugoslavia had never existed before. There had been the Kingdom of Serbia in the Middle Ages, but it had not included Croatia or Bosnia or Macedonia. But the creation of the state of Yugoslavia ultimately led to a very violent breakup in the 1990s, where ethnic cleansing and genocide occurred between Serbs and Croats and Bosnians, and it was a really hellish bloodbath. And it was partly because these nations that had very little in common were forcibly united under the auspices of pan-Serbian imperialism. But more relevant today is the Sykes-Picot Treaty of 1917, which ceded Palestine to Israel, essentially, and divided up the Ottoman Empire into the French Mandate of Lebanon and Syria and the English Mandate of Iraq and Transjordan, today Jordan. And we can even see this today because in ISIS, I remember I watched one of Vice's interviews with ISIS fighters. And there was this one ISIS fighter standing on the Syrian-Iraqi border saying, "Today we have destroyed the Sykes-Picot Treaty." I'm like, that was 100 years ago. And for them, that's like it was yesterday.
Yeah, that's interesting as well. That you do see a lot of these ethnic rivalries emerge during that time period that later become very significant. Talking about the legacy of Yugoslavia, one thing that the communist regime that was in power there for decades tried to do was cultivate a sense of internationalism among all the different ethnic groups that were being ruled by that regime. What we would call multiculturalism today, although they just called it internationalism. But they actually had a lot of the stuff there in Yugoslavia that we now think of as political correctness. They had hate speech laws and, anti-vilification laws and things of that nature. And what happened was that this communist regime tried to keep all of that ethnic hatred that had been built up in large part during the two world wars under wraps, if you will. And then when that regime fell apart, all of that exploded and came to the surface once again. So that situation is actually a case study in what problems you can encounter when you try to create a state apparatus that tries to force all of these rival ethnic groups under the same roof, and where that ultimately can lead.
Exactly. Even in today's Syria with Bashar al-Assad, he's, of course, Alawite, which is a minority Islamic sect within the larger Islamic world. Sunni Islam is the dominant religion of Syria. Now, in the French Mandate of Syria and Lebanon, they empowered the minorities. So in Lebanon, it was the Christians, and in Syria, it was the Alawites, which is the ethnic violence we saw in Lebanon in the late 70s, early 80s. And the current crisis we see now in Syria is in part the result of the restructuring of political power that the French had instituted at the end of the First World War. And of course, the Arab-Israeli conflict, again, goes back to the Sykes-Picot Treaty. And then, of course, the most obvious fallout was the Treaty of Versailles, which, due to its cruelty and short-sightedness, guaranteed a second war. It was 100 years earlier in the Congress of Vienna. The French got off relatively well because they had an advocate, Teyrenald, and he was able to advocate the French cause. And the balance of power was largely maintained. The French didn't lose too much territory, and the indemnities weren't too heavy. The Allies at Versailles intentionally did not want a German advocate because they did not want a repeat of the gentle Treaty of Vienna. And in fact, in 1918, Austria would have voted a plebiscite to join Germany. But again, the Allies, wanting to make Germany weaker, did not want to. National determination is all well and good, except for Germans. The Austrians cannot exercise national determination, but the Czechs and Hungarians and Poles can. And, many nations were created that never even existed before, like Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. These sort of composite regimes that just, or the states in the Middle East that just could never reasonably be expected to hold together. And surely the short-sightedness and the cruelty of the treaty guaranteed another war. Had it been a Treaty of Vienna or a Treaty of Westphalia, there might not have been a World War II if they had learned from the lessons of previous European conflicts and created a treaty that left everybody basically happy. They could have had maybe another 100 years of peace, as was the case after the Treaty of Vienna.
Yeah. Well, it's obviously one of the biggest blunders that came in the aftermath of the war is the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, there's no question that the kind of vindictive nature of the terms of that treaty essentially is what ignited World War II as essentially a sequel to World War I. And if that situation had been handled better, I think it's likely the Second World War could have been avoided. And I think ideology played a role in that, as well as the other issues, the geopolitical issues and territorial rivalries and things like that. I think that there was just this view of the Germans among a lot of people in the more liberal nations that the Germans were this kind of aggressive, barbarian, backward, militaristic society, and that they had been responsible for the war, and that this was sort of a righteous revenge on them. It's the same kind of psychology. It's a continuation of the same kind of psychology that came out of the U.S. Civil War, where you had a lot of folks in the North who, they didn't just view this as a territorial war or whatever. They viewed this as a righteous crusade. I mean, even if you look at the Civil War, you had songs that came out of the war, like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and what is this? How does that song start? It's the "Mine eyes have seen the glory" or something like that.
It's the coming of the Lord. Yeah.
It's like a jihad or something. They think they're fighting. And I think that kind of thinking extends on into World War I. I think that a lot of the liberal nations, even the ones that were secular, largely secular, where their elites were at least secular, I think even there you see the same kind of thinking, where they really came to believe that this was a war for liberalism and democracy and all of these and universal values, and the legacy of the French Revolution, the legacy of the Enlightenment, the legacy of all these other things, and they came to view the Germans as somehow being antithetical to that. The Germans were somehow the remnants of the older, reactionary, monarchist, militarist, static, stratified, static type of societies. Even though the Germans were an extremely advanced society at the time, they were as advanced as any of the other nations were in terms of their technology, and
maybe even more so in some cases.
Yeah, their science and their intellectual culture and all of that. But I do think that's a perception that was that many had of the Germans. They were the Huns. They were the barbarian Huns, and I think that was kind of the mentality behind Versailles. It's about getting even with these people that are considered unenlightened, reactionary, whatever. It's almost like the kind of things we saw during the Afghan war and the Iraq war, where you had guys like Christopher Hitchens, who very much reflected that kind of that kind of liberal, progressive Enlightenment type of outlook. A guy like that saying we're going to bomb the Afghans out of the Stone Age. I think that kind of thinking played a role in making Versailles what it was, and I think that vengeance against an ideological enemy was a big part of that.
Yeah. Given the horrible effects of the end of the First World War, the rise of Bolshevism, the rise of Nazism, the Second World War, the ethnic conflict in the Middle East and in Yugoslavia, we have to ask ourselves, might it not have been better had the Central Powers won? In fact, in 1950, hold on a second. I just had the guy's name on the tip of my tongue, and I forgot. George Kennan, in his he gave a speech about American foreign policy, and it was later written down into a little pamphlet. And he said basically in 1950 we were less safe now than we'd ever been before in our history, because at that point the Soviets had atomic weapons. But he said that looking back, past the two world wars, was Imperial Germany all that bad? compared to Nazism and Soviet communism and now Chinese communism. 50, we were fighting them in Korea, I think, at that point. Was it really all that bad? Now, one of the things that you and I talked about this after our World War II podcast off air was that between 1830 and 1930 was a kind of a golden age for Jews in Eastern and Central Europe under the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary and the Hohenzollerns in Germany. If the Germans had won the First World War, now it all depends on when they win it. If they win it in 1914 or in 1918, it's somewhat dependent. But certainly by 1918, they'd annexed large tracts of Russia. And those tracts of Russia correspond to the Pale of Settlement. In Tsarist Russia, prior to the First World War, there was a Pale of Settlement, which included Central Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Belarus, where the Jews were located. They were kicked out of the rest of Russia into that area. Now, the Pale of Settlement was more or less what the Germans annexed with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So the entire Jewish population of Eastern Europe by 1918 was under German-Austrian control. And one could argue, for all the crocodile tears cried over the Jews, that the best possible outcome for the Jews in Eastern and Central Europe would have been a German victory in the First World War. It would have removed the Jews from under Russian occupation, placed them under the control of the Germans and the Austrians. And the German post-war plan of Middle Europa, of creating a Central Eastern European economic combine, was quite willing to incorporate the Jews as sort of co-managers of this new regime because of their financial savvy, their entrenched wealth, and high intelligence. And it's quite likely that of all the possible alternatives for a peaceful Jewish future, that would have been the best.
Yeah, well, as far as the idea that the world would have been a better place if the Central Powers had won, I think looking back at that from the point of view of a century of hindsight, I think that's without question the case, that it would have been better if the Central Powers had won. In fact, I've made the argument for many years in the United States, again getting back to the Civil War, that the defeat of the South in the American Civil War had extremely long-range consequences for world history. A big part of that because if the South had won that war, the United States would have been split into two republics. You probably wouldn't have seen this kind of aggressive westward expansion in North America to the degree that we saw after the Civil War. But perhaps even more importantly for the world as a whole would have been the fact that the United States would not have emerged as this massive continent-wide industrial power that was in turn able to enter into World War I and provide the Allies with a decisive victory, which in turn allowed for the ruin of Germany, for the punitive terms that were imposed on Germany at Versailles, that also resulted in the loss of the Russian Empire and the Bolshevik Revolution, and the loss of the Austria-Hungary Empire and the loss of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, who would not accept a return of the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austrian-Hungary Empire, and the Ottoman Empire in exchange for the things that came afterward? I mean, if we look at what happened for decades, and even today, we're still seeing the ramifications of this, in the sense that because of the Russian Revolution, which was made possible by the First World War, we see the rise of world communism, which came to dominate a third of the world at one particular point. And then there was the arms race and all of the things that came out of that. Because of the defeat of Germany, we see the rise of Nazism and World War II and everything that came along with that. Because of the defeat of Austria-Hungary, if it hadn't have been for that, we would not have ever had the communist takeover of Yugoslavia. We would have never had the wars that took place there in the 1990s. If it hadn't have been for the loss of the Ottoman Turks, we would not have all of the stuff that goes on in the Middle East today. Who would not trade ISIS for the Ottoman Turks? The So I think that the war itself was an extremely tragic thing. Obviously, even more tragic was that the wrong side won. The the If the Germans had emerged victorious from that war, or at least even if if they had fought to a stalemate, even if the Second Reich or the Imperial Germany had remained intact, as you said, there would have never been the Holocaust. In fact, the Jews would have been much better off. Prior to the Nazi Revolution in 1933, Germany was one of the best places in the world for Jews to live. If, as you were saying, Germany had extended its hand into Eastern Europe, into the Pale settlement regions and all of that, the Jews there would have been much better off. You were far better off being a Jew and living under the Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany than you were if you lived under Tsarist Russia. So virtually every tragedy in Europe, and quite a few of them in Asia, are traceable to this, or traceable to the fact that really what happened was that the wrong side won in the First World War. And as I always like to trace this back to the American Civil War. Here in the United States, of course, it's becoming increasingly fashionable to regard the Confederacy as the symbol of all evil. I've heard the Confederacy as having been referred to as the Nazi Germany of North America and things like that. But,
well, in fact, the Harry Turtledove, he's an alternative history author. He basically makes the Confederacy the Nazis of his fictional World War II.
Okay. Yeah, but if the U.S. had been split up into two republics back then, you never would have had American intervention in World War I. You never would have had the defeat of the Central Powers to the degree that they were defeated because of American involvement. And
maybe the wrong side won that war too.
What's that? Which one?
About the Civil War. Maybe the wrong side won that war too. So.
The wrong side won the Civil War?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think the wrong side did win the Civil War in the United States. I think if the South had won, we would have had two republics rather than one. We never would have had the aggressive westward expansion and the virtual annihilation of the native people. We never would have had the aggressive expansion into the Pacific, which in turn led to American involvement in the Second World War in Asia. We never would have had the American involvement in Europe during World War I, and the defeat of the Central Powers, and the rise of communism in Russia, and the rise of Nazism in Germany, and the destruction of the Ottoman system in Asia. I mean, in the Middle East and Central Asia, and all of the things that have come out of that since then. So yeah, I mean, that's really set the whole ball in motion. As far as the U.S. Civil War, I mean, the slavery in the South would have been phased out anyway. I mean,
real quick, the Confederacy actually did begin the process of abolishing slavery in April of 1865, under pressure from the United States, or from Britain and France, in order to get international recognition. They set in motion a process by why Negroes could serve in the Confederate Army to then earn their freedom. But it was sadly too little too late.
Yeah, well, slavery existed in Brazil during that same time period, and it was phased out by peaceful means. I mean, they didn't have a war that killed 500,000 people the way the United States did, and it would have been phased out anyway for purely economic reasons, because it just wouldn't have been economically viable it wouldn't have been able to compete with northern industrial labor. It just wouldn't have been possible. So it was simply becoming increasingly obsolete anyway. So yeah, I mean, all of these things I think set in motion a really terrible chain of events. And one long-standing debate that I have with a lot of people on the political left is that I always say that the enemy that's closest to you is not necessarily your worst enemy. Or no, the enemy that's furthest from you is not necessarily your worst enemy, because for the to the left, of course, the ultimate evil is Nazism and things of that nature. And I always say, well, look, without the defeat of the Confederacy in the Civil War, there would have never been American intervention in World War One. Without World War One and the defeat of the Central Powers, there never would have been Nazism. So it's in their zeal to wipe out all of these older, more traditional, monarchical type of regimes. During the First World War, they really created the pretext in which Nazism and fascism were able to arise. The systems that were, I mean, if we look at what replaced, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungary Empire, the Ottoman Empire, I mean, that really is how modern 20th century totalitarianism begins. It's with the defeat of Germany, we get Nazism. With the defeat of or the overthrow of the Tsar, we get communism. In the Ottoman world, in those regions, what kinds of systems have ruled that part of the world since the Ottoman era?
Nothing better.
Yeah, these really reactionary, Bronze Age, fiefdoms or totalitarian dictators like, say, Saddam Hussein, or other types of extremist movements, or and these these primitive barbarians like ISIS. I think probably most people in the Middle East today probably wouldn't mind having the Ottoman Turks back.
Probably not.
Compared to what they've dealt with since then. So yeah, it's really interesting to see how this particular war had such far-reaching consequences and in so many different ways.
One of the interesting things as well is if the Central Powers had been victorious, I think it's quite likely that even though the Archduke was assassinated, his plan of a federal Austria would have been implemented, because it was the only real solution to the problem of a multi-ethnic state in Austria. Now, one can speculate on what would it have been like having a state based on the American system in the very middle of Europe. One can speculate on, would that have created a general federative solidarity throughout Europe, providing a beacon of how to resolve ethnic disputes without going to these fratricidal conflicts? Because if Austria could pull it off and adopt a federal system and get all these different minorities to work together like they do in the United States and Switzerland, the other Europeans could say, hey, this works. Maybe we should try it out. And if that had happened, you might have had a kind of proto-European Union where they federate around these common principles backed by Germany and its economic might, which would have been, well, that's the other thing. The Germany is the dominant economic power in Europe and is the European Union. The capital is not really Brussels, it's really Berlin. So we fought 2 world wars to prevent the inevitable. Well, why not just let the inevitable happen without killing 100 million people and keeping the Kaiser in charge, is what I say.
Yeah, the Germany today really is the backbone of the European Union. I mean, there is no EU without Germany, and Germany is, I mean, even during the period of the Cold War, when Germany was split in half, or half of it was under the control of the Soviet Union, even then, just West Germany, the Federal Republic, emerged as a major world economic power that eventually was catching up with the United States. By the 1970s, 1980s, the United States, Germany, and West Germany and Japan were the world's economic powers. Germany was really the center of the European economy, and that it's going to be like that. I mean, as long as there's a Europe, Germany's going to be the dominant power there. So yeah, as you were saying, it is interesting that we're really right back where we started. You had in the early 20th century, you had the Imperial Germany as the dominant power in Central and Western Europe. Then you had and then that was followed by Nazism, and now it's the same thing once again. So it's really never changed. I mean, the outward form has changed, obviously, but Germany's still there. It's still there as the central power in Europe.
Well, as they say, demographics is destiny. If the British and the French had lost, uh, do you think they would have experienced a radical revolution like Russia did?
Oh, if the French and the Germans had lost the First World War,
No, the French and the
I mean,
British.
the French and the British. Oh, that's interesting. Well, the
I think the French might have gone communist. They have a penchant for
yeah,
radical left-wing politics.
yeah. I was just thinking that when you asked that, I was thinking, well, the French Communist Party was the large in post-war in post-World War II Europe. The French Communist Party was the largest communist party in Western Europe. Well, that one and the one in Italy were the two largest communist parties in Western Europe. And the French Communist Party, perhaps more importantly, was the last one to de-Stalinize. I mean, they were full-on Stalinist, right up until about the end. The During the 1960s and 1970s, the communist parties in Italy and Spain and some other places started developing an outlook they called Euro communism, which is sort of like social democracy. They were sort of moving in a more reformist or quote unquote liberal direction or whatever. But the Communist Party of France was a full on pro Soviet Stalinist party right up until I guess probably the 80s. I have a friend of mine who is from France. He's in his 60s, and he grew up in the French Communist Party. His parents were hardcore French Communist Party members. He was involved in the Paris uprising in 1968 as a college student. And after that, a lot of the students actually decided that the French Communist Party, which was still a Stalinist party, was not radical enough. And this guy eventually became a Maoist in the 70s. In fact, I remember when I first met him, it was in the 80s, and he was still an unreconstructed Stalinist. He was, very pro-Soviet, Maoism. He thought it was awful that Deng. This is when Deng was still in power in China. He thought that was awful that Deng was implementing, market reforms and that kind of thing. He despised Gorbachev. He was an admirer of Nikolai Ceausescu and guys like that. The French Communist Party was the real deal. So I think it's quite possible if they had actually experienced the loss of World War One, that they might have experienced some kind of extremist revolution of that type. The English, not so much.
I think they might not. They wouldn't have gone communist anyhow.
The English just aren't quite as prone to that kind of extremism as some of the other continental European countries were. The English just do everything in sort of a light way. I guess it's part of that is probably their liberal history and heritage. That's really the country where liberalism really got started, I think, and it's that I think it's kind of like that's good enough for them. It's they don't really need Jacobinism or communism or Nazism or any of these other things.
Yeah, I do think though that if they had lost, remember there was the general strike of 1926. They did a very, very powerful communist labor movement. I think what would have happened in England is something like what happened in Germany in our timeline. There would have been communist revolutions, but the army would have remained loyal, like in Germany, and the army would have crushed the communist resistance, much as it did in Germany during our timeline, where the Freikorps, the ex-German soldiers, crushed the communist revolutions. Do you think England might have been susceptible to fascism in the 20s if they had lost World War One?
Well, I think that would have been more plausible. They did have the Mosleyite movement in England in the 30s, so it's possible that something like that could have become much more influential. It's also interesting to consider what might have happened to the United States if the United States had not entered World War One, say, and then Wilson had not been able to use that as a pretext for suppressing the labor movement. If the Socialist Party, say, had continued to grow and become more influential, and the IWW and all the radical labor and socialist-oriented groups in the U.S. you had back then, it had actually perhaps survived longer and become more influential. It's interesting to see where the United States might have gone as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think the French, if they had lost, I don't think the military would have been ideologically loyal to the government. I mean, after all, there was the French mutiny in the trenches in 1917. Much as in Russia, during their revolution, the army was not loyal to the Tsar. It defected, and that led to the revolution, and then the Bolsheviks wooed some of the soldiers, and the whites wooed some of the soldiers. I think in France, the army might have just stood by and let the revolution happen if they had lost and there was a revolution in France, which that would have been very strange. But again, it would be expected, right? There was a revolution in 1789. There was a revolution in 1830 and 1848. And then there was a revolution in 1871, but that was suppressed by the government. So France is prone to these radical socialist revolutions.
Well, and they also were prone to revolution from the right as well. They had in the 1930s, they had Marshal Pétain come in as well and impose the new order. And this was before the German invasion. This was sort of a prelude to Vichy and all of that. And they also had the restoration, of Louis Bonaparte.
And Napoleon III, yeah.
Yeah, so they were prone, throughout their history, they were prone to this kind of extreme, the kind of veering back and forth from extreme right to extreme left.
Yeah, so I think France could either go communist or fascist. It would be interesting if the Allies had lost. Would maybe a second round have occurred with a bunch of radical communists and fascists running the former Allied powers, trying to fight off against Germany, which is a more moderate constitutional government,
Yeah, that would have been interesting.
But I think we're about out of time. But thanks again for coming on, Keith Preston. It's a pleasure as always.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is Todd Lewis, host of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.